drinking a little bit of Etna wine, and here I'm having something tonight, the Super Luna from Masseria del Pino on the north slope of Etna, and that's certainly helping.
Oh, very good. In my glass, there is a rosé wine from Cotanera, from our good friend Mariangela Cambria. Cheers.
Cheers.
It might sound weird starting L'Isola Bella stories with a special guest who is clearly not Sicilian nor Italian, but I have to say that Ben is a fantastic writer. He holds a WSET diploma, and most of all, he lives in a village at the base of the volcano with his lovely wife, Nadine. Hi, Nadine. And this makes Ben an adopted local. I met Ben a few years ago. Do you remember, Ben? We were sitting at the bar, sipping a glass of wine and discussing our personal projects and our common project. Ben, I think you were just starting working on the book, which seemed to me a great idea.
Yeah, I remember that. That was a beautiful night in Santa Venerina, actually, just over near Murgo.
That's right. That's right. Then last January, I got my copy of his book, printed, signed, and delivered right to my door by his author in person.
Yeah.
I was very curious, and I immediately started reading it. And I discovered things that I didn't know about Ben, about his previous life in US, about his new life in Sicily. Of course, I learned a lot about Mount Etna as a wine region and about its volcanic wine. Congrats, Ben. You did a tremendous job.
Thank you very much.
Say, not an easy one, I guess.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part there. Say again?
Not an easy job, I mean. You did.
No, not at all. The book actually took 4 years from the first moment of, actually we sent out a questionnaire to all of the producers and realized very quickly that there was more to the story than just who's making wine on Etna, what grapes they're growing, and what wines they're producing. So I started to dig a little bit deeper, reading one book after the other, and then following the links of those books and the resources in those books to find yet more books and develop my own story. I was very curious about the area, and at the time it was terribly hard to find any information about Etna in the general public domain, apart from articles and magazines and newspapers. So I went out on my own to develop the book, but also to develop my courses with Etna Wine School.
Great. I have to say that the way you wrote the book is actually very interesting, and it's intriguing how you can find different levels of reading. I mean, as a reader, you find the technical lexicon and any information you expect to satisfy people in the industry or wine lovers who know a lot about wine. But the way you let your own voice come out also stick quite to a prose style. So sometimes you even forget you are reading a book with such an amount of technical information, and you just think that you are reading a novel. I really think that this book fits everyone.
I agree. I definitely agree.
And carefully reading the book, there were some sentences which I couldn't keep out of my mind, and I would like to keep them in the conversation and starting from them. For example,
sure.
This one, I never intended to live on a volcano. Where I grew up in upstate New York, it was generally accepted that volcanoes are dangerous places. Nor was wine a big part of my childhood. As far as was concerned, wine was just another bad beverage choice.
Yeah.
I mean, this has made me laugh a lot.
Yeah, me
And
too.
the question is, tell us more about your story, because behind these words, I think there is a story.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I mean, what can you say about 40 plus years on this planet? But yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, and everyone drank a lot of beer or boxed wine in those days, and that was very popular. My mom would drink.
Why?
Oh yeah, box wine with the little bag inside, and
My God.
yeah, but it was what my mom loved, and so that was pretty much the only wine I saw, except for some cold duck around the holidays. And I don't know if you've ever had cold duck, but it's a sparkling, slightly sweet wine that has, in my opinion, probably some of the worst flavors for a child to taste. But it comes out of a very old tradition in Germany, and extra wines around the winery. But in any case, from there, I really didn't have any interest in wine until I got into cooking, which I did for 10 years. And after cooking, I found an apprenticeship in winemaking in California. It was a 10-week job that turned into now a full career going on 20 years. And I've hated several moments of that career and absolutely loved a great majority of it. It's a fascinating thing to study, wine. Once you get past what's actually in the magazines, once you get past the wine scores, there's an incredible amount of poetry and geology, geography, and history to wine. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I definitely dove into this book and tried to find all the answers to the questions that I was curious about. And for me, that was crucial also to share that with you and with the other readers so that they too could enjoy and understand Etna on another level.
So the fifth alcohol duck, John from Malta, say, yes, had that before, like affordable champagne. Too sweet, though.
Yeah,
Hi,
definitely.
how are you?
Thanks for that comment. That's great.
Yeah. And I was thinking, how did it happen for you to think about writing such a book?
Yeah. Honestly, I began with a little bit of data about the wineries, who was making wine here, because the Etna wine region, if your viewers don't know already, is a very small boutique volcanic terroir in eastern Sicily and southern Italy, and it is very historic. It's got an ancient wine tradition, but for me, that history had not really been collected just yet. And so I really jumped from the data about who was making wine here to what was the territory that they were making wine in. And that's a beautiful shot of Catania with the mountain volcano rising up above it, and the Ionian Sea there on the bottom. But for me, that history is where a lot of it started, and from that, the data and all of the stories really kind of started to unravel and form a narrative that is the book that you're reading today.
Great. Another question, another sentence of the book that is pretty much intriguing is when you write Mount Etna is a sunny, windy, and rainy wine region with vineyards growing at elevation on the side of an active volcano in close proximity to the sea. No vintage is the same. I mean, this tells a lot about Mount Etna as a wine region and tells also a lot about the different terroirs that you might expect to find on Mount Etna. Am I right or wrong?
You're absolutely right. Mount Etna stands 10,600 feet above sea level. And so for the weather alone, the mountain changes the path of wind streams. It changes also the amount of humidity that gathers up around the volcano. The elevation also permits for snow and extreme amounts of rain on the east slope of the volcano, where we have more dry environments on the west. So also at the sea level, we have more or less a subtropical environment. But as we go up the volcano, up the slopes, we end up with a pre-alpine, four-season climate that really changes the profile of these wines and makes them super elegant, and at the lower elevations more full-bodied and fruitier. But that is just the climate. Once we get into the volcanics and the geology of this 250,000-year-old volcano, you end up with different striations, different ages of volcanic soils, different fertility, or concentrations of sand or rock, and volcanic craters where there are vineyards growing on them. It's the most dynamic and wonderful place to taste wines, to experience the area if you can come here, but also to just really dive into the variations within the Etna DOC wines, but also the wines that are not in the Etna DOC. And
we'll come to this later. We come to this later because I have some questions about all the wines that are out the Etna DOC.
Okay.
It's nice to also to explore this concept through your own words.
Of course, yeah.
You write, what the winemaker chooses to do with those grapes has everything to do with the wine they intend to make. I think you are talking about a declaration of intent, which has to be the starting point in every winery, especially on Mount Etna. Is this what you mean?
Correct, because there are so many variables to play with, namely the age of vines or the training systems, the fertility in the vineyard, the idea also of your brand concept, what a winery wants to produce from that vineyard or from multiple vineyards. And so what we see really is the winemaker playing an important part of the terroir story in each of the wines. You end up with just as much of an influence in the way the wine tastes in your glass coming directly from the winemaker's intention in the cellar, but also beginning in the vineyard, whether they leave more clusters on the vines or de-leaf at particular times. These are all very important choices. In the cellar, for me, every little thing that we do matters, and that for Etna really is the key phrase. On Etna, everything matters, and for certain, the winemakers are a huge part of that story.
How much in the balance of winemaking on Mount Etna, the ancient history of winemaking has its own weight?
Yeah, it really does, and it's a bit of I guess what I would call a gravity for Etna. It keeps keeps the producers in a localized area. It keeps them grounded to a tradition, namely Caricante for the white grapes and Nerello for the black grapes, Nerello Mascalese and Nerello Capuccio. But we also have traditions. There was a few slides back of the large chestnut barrels that come directly from the forests on Etna. Not a lot of producers use those anymore, and they have fallen out of favor for more modern, tight grain French oak from the eastern departments of France, and also Slavonia. But these large barrels are very much part of the tradition of Etna, and the important movement in the 1700s by the merchants who were buying a lot of the wines for blending up other wines in cooler regions of Northern Europe or the northern part of Europe as far as Sicily is concerned. And so the flavors that chestnut, for example, donate to the wine, it's not just flavor, it's aroma, but it's also a little bit of color stability for Nerello. And if you can imagine merchants traveling from the port of Riposto, which we just saw a moment ago, to Genoa with the boat laden with barrels in the sun and then the night, and the sun and the night, that takes a toll on wine. But with chestnut, those flavors actually fixed a lot better for the Nerello. And so you see this effort to repeat these recipes for some wineries, and for others, they're taking it as an opportunity to innovate and to move forward and produce some super fine wines that are catching a lot of people's attention around the globe right now.
Great. You mentioned the Caricante, which is the grape for the Etna Bianco. And you're right. Etna Bianco is a white wine with immense potential. And I wonder, why do you think so? This is a very strong sentence to me.
Yeah. Well, Etna Bianco at its base is at least 60% Caricante with other Sicilian white varieties, non-aromatic varieties blended in. Most producers are increasing the percentage of Caricante in Etna Bianco, and this is to really create wines with great ageability, but also to really hone in on the fineness of these wines. And for me, what that means with Caricante is at harvest, very low yields. And on Etna, the Etna DOC does not allow for irrigation. So yields are kept to a minimum for the most part. But Caricante has also a really great acidity and very low potassium levels in the grape. And it's something that gives the wine a lot of potential for very slow and even aging over a great many years. And so for Etna Bianco and also Etna Bianco Superiore, which is grown around Milo, you see a lot of producers laying their bottles down for 10 years before they open them. And the wines have just a very nice freshness that continues to develop into really sort of mature citrus flavors and grasses and wild grasses, wild flowers. But also there's a note that comes through that's very similar to Riesling. It's
wait, all done. Speak. You wrote about the Caricante Riesling connection, which sounds a love affair, and we are talking about two grapes that I love a lot. Can you please go more deeper into this concept?
Sure. So what we're finding is that producers who, in cooler climates like Etna, because we're at elevation, or the growing area is typically at elevation, there are very cool days and very cold nights. The diurnal temperature shift is more of a shock, honestly. And for a lot of producers, especially in cooler vintages, it's very important to allow for the grapes to go from ripe to fully mature before they harvest the grapes. This is the way that they do that is they thin the fruit zone around the vine at the base of the arms where the fruit grows. And depending on when they do that, for example, about 60 days after fruit set, if they're thinning the leaves before that, the wines tend to have a touch more of this kerosene or petrol note that's so very attractive in small percentages for a lot of consumers and for a lot of wine.
It's the thing that I really love when I find this sort of petrol note hint in the wine. I really love it.
Yeah, me too. And it's one of the reasons why I started reaching for Riesling over and over and over again when I first got into wine. But it's basically just an exposure of the grapes to sunlight early on in their ripening phase. So the earlier that producers are de-leafing the fruit zone, they end up possibly with higher concentrations of what we call TDN. And it's a
very difficult name to pronounce, even in Italian. I can imagine in English, I cannot try.
Yeah, it's like a 700 letter word.
Yeah, that's very long. Getting back a little bit to the Etna Bianco Superiore, do you think this wine is somehow comparable to any of the greatest white wines in the world?
I absolutely do. I typically joke that I moved to Etna for Nerello Mascalese, which is one of my favorite red wines in the world. But Caricante has really grown on me. And that particular site in Milo is at the
Benanti estate in Milo, right?
I'm sorry?
That's the Benanti estate in Milo?
Correct. That is the new Benanti vineyard in Contrada Rinazzo, at the base of the Valle del Bove in Milo. And it's all Albarello or Albarelli trained against chestnut stakes in a very soft volcanic sand that was distributed over this area about 8,000 years ago. And then again, 5,000 years ago in two layers. And it's over time it has become Milo, and the Contrada within the commune of Milo has become the place to make Etna Bianco Superiore. And this is the legal designation for these grapes. And it's at minimum 80% Caricante. Most producers are pushing that closer to 100%, but you still have these relic varieties in the vineyards that add a little bit of spice and uniqueness to each of the wines. But Milo and Caricante go hand in hand. And for me, Etna Bianco Superiore, especially in the greatest years and the best vintages, we see incredible potential. The Benanti wines, in particular, Pietramarina, I believe last year or the year before, was named the best white wine in Italy. So you get an idea of, just not my opinion, but many others, how good this wine can be, especially when it's treated as in an anaerobic fermentation without air, and it's left to age on its fine lees for a good amount of time before it's released. But we can see these wines age up to 20 years without a problem.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, this is really something that may compete with the greatest white wines in the world. Definitely, yes, definitely, yes. And you said, and you wrote that when people ask why you came to Etna, you always tell them, I fell in love with a grape, Nerello Mascarese, to be precise.
Yeah. If my wife is watching this, she'll probably differ, and she'll say that it was her that brought me here, and I tend to agree with her on that. But it was definitely Nerello has this really sort of mystical quality to it for me, and the way it communicates the terrain of Etna, and the way it speaks of this terroir and the hyper localization of this terroir, with all these different lava flows and with all the massive eruptions that throw pyroclastic sand. It changes the environment. It changes the environment in layers, which is what the roots tap into. And so every Nerello vineyard is quite unique, and every Etna Rosso or Etna Red, whether it's DOC or IGT or Doc Sicilia, it changes. And this for me was really eye-opening, because the wines are never the same year in and year out. The vintages change, as we discussed before. The angle and the aspect and the elevation of the vineyards change the flavor as well. But the winemaker's intention adds to it again. And so for me, Nerello Mascarese is the grape to check out here on Etna, and Etna Rosso is the designation that you should look for on the bottle.
Do you find the Nerello Mascarese a difficult or an easy grape to deal with?
Yeah, it's very finicky. When it's not ripe, it shows a lot of green character, a lot of bell pepper or tomato vine. So it's crucial to let the vines and the grapes age or mature to the last possible moment before the rains start, typically in October. And for me, it's also a balance of acidity and cool years. The skins can be very thick, and so we have to watch tannins. The esters, the aromas of the grape, are very delicate as well. So it's important to protect those. So cool fermentations and closed anaerobic, so no oxygen involved fermentations, where the juice is allowed to collect on the top of the tank and fall back into the must. It's a very crucial element to retain the most that we can from the grapes. But this is my opinion. Now, a lot of producers are still making the wines in not temperature-controlled vats to honor the traditions of Etna, where wines were made in palmento. And palmento, for those who don't know, are graduated, gravity-operated wineries that are constructed in basalt or lava stone. And so you see a lot of producers using these options to innovate in their own way and to show Nerello Mascarese in a traditional sort of view, if you will, or they're showing what it can be as a very delicate, beautiful wine that the market appreciates. And so here on Etna, it's variety and it's absolute fineness in most cases. There are a few stinkers out there, I have to say, but that's normal. There are bad vintages across the board in every region, but the intention here is absolutely 100% going forward.
John says it's great that vintages changes every year, but there never seems to be a bad vintage. Or have I been just lucky that Sicilian wines have always been good? Thank you, John. We appreciate you love Sicilian wines, well, wines from Mount Etna in this case.
Yeah, and it's true that that a lot of the local wines have really been turning heads, and that's a tribute to all the effort that the producers are putting into the work in the vineyards and in the cellars, and into the packaging of the wines that keeps the wine safe as it gets shipped from here to Livorno and then overseas to wherever it goes. And so there is a lot to it, but yeah, the wines are fantastic. I wouldn't be talking about them. I wouldn't have written a book about it if I didn't believe that 100%.
Federico, hi Federico.
Hey,
from
Federico.
Nino, so a winemaker, says, I agree with you, Benjamin. We need a medley way to follow between tradition and innovation. And
Yeah.
we agree with you, Federico. Thanks a lot for the comment. Now the question is there are any similarities between the Nerello Mascalese and the Pinot Noir?
For me, they're both vines, both grapes that translate the terroir in which they're planted into the glass. They do this really well. They're mimics of the terroir. And for me, that's the interesting thing. However, on Etna, if we're seeing Pinot Noir planted and bottled, the Pinot tends to be not Pinot Noir from Etna, but Etna Pinot Noir, in the sense that Etna tends to trump anything that hasn't come of age here. And so there isn't this historical connection between the two. And so for me, international varieties like Merlot and Pinot and Chardonnay have an Etna qualifier or Etna caveat to them. And they are absolutely fantastic wines. And I've made plenty of Pinot Noir in my days, but it's always Etna Pinot Noir. And for Nerello Mascalese, it's always Etna.
Great. And let's get back to the sentence, no two wines are ever the same.
Yeah.
This means that it is difficult for red wines from Mount Etna to be identified on under common terms. I mean, can we talk about territorial wines? And
Absolutely.
another question. Can you tell us more about the contrade system and how they affect the winemaking so that no two wines are ever the same?
Sure. Well, this is a great question. There are so many aspects to Etna. To say Etna is one thing is, in my opinion, a huge mistake, because it is not one thing. It is a mountain. It is layers of time. It's layers of terroir. It's ideas, ideals. It's wars. All of this is folded into the terroir. The contrada system takes that entire landscape and breaks it up into sections. Now, those sections, the contrada system is based on 20 different communes or municipalities that cross the Etna DOC, which is a semicircle that goes around the volcano from the south to the east to the north. Within those 20 communes, there are 133 contrada. Now,
that's a lot.
That's a lot. But these are neighborhoods. In some cases, they're small, and in some cases, they're large. But they're always separated by natural and administrative boundaries. And what I mean by that is elevation or lava flows or creeks can change the contrada or create a natural border, which then automatically changes the contrada administratively. But there are also roads and the Circumetnea train track, which circumnavigates the mountain. And this also breaks up the municipalities into these neighborhoods, districts, or contrada. When we see contrada names on the labels, and if you look in the back of the new wines of Etna, there are the names of all of the contrada, so people can identify those names. And
that's right. I was looking at the bottle. Yes.
And the contradas that way are not going to be confused with proprietary names, for example. But the contrada system gives us the opportunity to explore the differences of each of these neighborhoods and define for ourselves whether there is potential or not for that area. Because they're already in the DOC, we know that Professor Nicolosi Asmundo and his other two colleagues who wrote the DOC laws between 65 and 68 went through and tasted all the wines from the vineyards in this area and said there are differences between this side of the street and the other side of the street. And so this side of the street is included in the DOC and the other side is not, because there are just subtle variations in the flavors or the color or the acidity of the wines that are produced from that area.
So Federico says, I think the contrada is the only way for us producer have the possibility to be unique. Basically, we can say that the contrada system is a good selling point.
Yeah, it's a great way for us to understand Etna and the little pockets of unique volcanics. But behind that is also the winemaker's intention, and for them to follow through is to make a fantastic wine. For them to sleep half the vintage away is to make maybe a wine that could also double as a salad vinegar. But in any case, there are very, very few, if any, producers doing that today. That my point for the contrada system is it is a great way for us to look at Etna, break it up, and consider the possibilities and the variables within the idea of what Etna is.
Well, basically, it's the cruise system they have in France, more or less.
More or less, but
more or less, yeah.
There's extremes when it comes to Etna.
Yeah. Alberto Baffumi from Malta. Hi, Alberto. Where are you? Says, Narello Mascalese, what is the potential of aging according to you then?
For me, it depends on your palate. I have a winemaker's palate, honestly, and so I typically prefer wines that are younger. So I say that the potential of Narello is probably 10 years to 20 years, depending on how good the wines were made. And that there does need to be a few years of bottle aging before they are tasted. Just so all of the territory, the intention, and the vintage come together into the winemaking and make it a unified wine. I see Giovanni's comment or question there.
Ragusa says, my opinion, the red Etna wines give their best after at least 4 years of aging.
Yeah, and I think this is a good target to start with. If you drink them too young, they can be a little aggressive. The tannins can be a little aggressive, and they don't really seem unified. Now, that said, there are producers who are not using any additives or sulfites in the production. And so after 4 years, the wines may not taste quite as fresh. So it's crucial to know who's making the wine and what their protocols are in the cellar to judge which direction to go, whether to cellar or to drink the wines.
Good point. Good point. Let's move on. The best years for Etna Spumante are the worst years for table wines. It takes time to learn these things, and we continue learning. You pick up the words of Michele Scamacca del Murgo about Etna sparkling wine. In this case, the metodo classico, right?
Correct. Yeah. Michele began experimenting with sparkling wines in 1989. And it was in Santa Venerina, that area where they have their farm, their big estate. And we speak frequently. Whenever I see Michele, we usually sit down and have a nice conversation. And we're both very technical when it comes to winemaking. And he truly believes that a poor vintage for table wines, what we consider Etna Rosso, Etna Bianco, is a terrible vintage for them, is a perfect vintage for Spumante. But this is partly because the grapes are harvested earlier when there's not a lot of sugar, but there's still a lot of acidity. The reason being that the wines go through a second bottle fermentation where sugar and yeast are added to the base wine, and then the wines are bottled. So a second fermentation could take place. In that moment, there's a little bit more alcohol developed, and so you get a little bit more body in that. But you have to kind of play with the grapes earlier. And so when it's bad weather, Michele is happy for the Spumante, and when it's really nice weather, he's happy for the table wines that they make. So either way, I think Michele's happy.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I read something that really puzzled me. Passito was and still is a luxury. Well, reading the book, I discovered we do Passito wines on Mount Etna.
Correct.
I had no clue about this. And how is Passito like on Mount Etna? And do you see any future for Passito wine on Mount Etna? I mean, both Passito and Etna Spumante, I think they are both niches, right?
Yeah.
So they have to compete and stand out in the wine world somehow.
Right, and I think this is an interesting point because the Passito is basically a raisin wine where the grapes are hand harvested, very gently laid out to dry in the sun over a couple of weeks before they're turned into wine. And so what we're seeing is more of a technical element in the winemaking than a terroir expression. I mean, at least for me. And so from that point of view, you end up with winemakers doing things to the wine that gives this traditional ancient style about it. Now, raisin wines have been made throughout the Mediterranean since antiquity, and it was a great way to store wines for a long period of time. There's a lot more sugar involved in the resulting wine, a lot more acidity because you dehydrate all of the water, which dilutes these things in the drying process. And so there is a huge tradition for these wines. Around the Crusades, there was a lot of imports by the Knights Hospitallers on the south slope of the volcano from Crete and Cyprus and Greece. A lot of the white grapes were brought over, planted, and used for raisin wines. But now there are producers like Nibali, who's doing Vinazzo, which is a vine-ripened Nerello Mascalese, black grape, which then they turn into, it's kind of like an Amarone for Etna.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely stellar in the best years, and they only do it in the best years.
Have to try.
Yeah, and there's also Destro and Hacienda Shara, Steph Yim's new project on the North Slope, and Destro has been making Anwar for several years, and it's a really luxurious wine. It goes great with chocolate or dates or pies. Ooh. Yeah.
Very, very wide in flowers.
Absolutely, cherries and plums and blueberries. Those are fantastic wines. Now, Barone de Villagrande makes Pasito from the island of Salina.
From the island, yes, from the Salina Island and the Aeolian Island. Yeah, yeah. Right. Karen asks, Karen from New York. Hi, Karen. Do you think more producers will begin making sparkling wines much like they did with the rosé?
Right. I do think more producers will make it. And right now we are seeing a huge increase in Spumante production. Unfortunately, it takes 2 to 3 years for those wines to come out. So we'll see an increase in the production of sparkling wines from a lot of wineries, but currently we're only at about 2.9% of the total production of those wines. The important thing is with that quantity of production is that the wines absolutely have to be beautiful, perfect. They have to turn heads, and they have to make people want the wines again.
Mm-hmm. And John asks, in terms of volume, roughly what percentage of wine produced in Sicily is from Mount Etna?
The production is always changing, but generally I think we're talking just 3%, 3 to 5%, depending on the vintage. My numbers are always changing. The 2019 numbers are just now coming in. But it's minuscule compared to what Etna was producing when the phylloxera boom occurred at the end of the 1800s, when the island was producing the mountain was producing 54% of the island's production.
Ooh, 54! So, that's a very, very large percentage.
Yeah. Well, when phylloxera hit continental Europe, all the merchants that had been buying wine in Riposto from the mountain, they were just encouraging people to plant more so they could feed the demand up north, and it exploded. So that's when you really see the vineyards from Lingua Glossa and west toward Randazzo being clear cut. They were hazelnuts and olive groves and pistachios the closer you got to Randazzo, but a lot of those were just clear cut and planted to vines, and that's where we see a lot of that expansion. But it was crucial to maintain supply, and so Etna was the place to come because of all of the variables, the difference in fruit and expression, the minerality, the elegance. It was all here, and the merchants could blend these wines together to satisfy any customer that they had.
Exactly. You were talking about this before. Now it's time to speak about those wines that are not included in the Etna DOC. And you write, wines that from vineyards that border the Etna DOC are some of the most interesting.
Yeah.
Do you mean that they have a larger way to experiment in terms of winemaking than those that are under the DOC protocol?
That is certainly part of it. The just crossing the street and falling outside of the DOC really is kind of a liberating thing. You're still dealing with the same grapes much of the time. Also old vines on a lot of occasions. And so they're very much Etna. They're volcanic. They're Norello musculese and Caricante, or if we go up to the northwest, you see Grecanico and also Alicante, which is Garnacha or Grenache, or Etna's version of it. And so for me, a lot of these wines that are just outside of the DOC, there's a lot more potential innovation, and there's a lot more flexibility for the producers to experiment in the cellar to make the wine exactly what they want it to be. And usually that target is very high quality, although it may not fit the tannins or the acidity levels established by the DOC. It does very much speak of the volcano. And
in
for me,
different ways, we can say. It speaks in different, we can say that they speak of the volcano in different ways than those under the DOC protocol.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's for example, Andrea Franchetti at Passo Bisciaro, he produces a lot of Norellos, a lot of different Contrada wines, and they're all within the DOC, but he chooses to bottle them as IGT wines, just because it suits his program, and it satisfies the winemaking production for him. It allows a little bit more of the flexibility that a lot of winemakers prefer, rather than having a super rigid recipe to adhere to.
Good. This has been really an enlightening conversation. Cheers, Ben. Grazie mille.
Yeah, I need a drink. Cheers.
And thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. I think we could talk about Etna for ages, and I wonder if you might be available for a next meeting. Wait, hold on. We have another question from Petros Kamurtos. Hi, from Malta.
Hey, Petros, how are you?
Is it time for an Etna DOCG? Wow. That's really an interesting debate, right?
That's a great question, Petros. There are discussions happening now. If you know the process of establishing a DOCG, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. And so the discussions are happening now, whether it's a good idea or not. Also, whether to expand or shift the borders of the DOC to satisfy some of these vineyards that are making very high quality Etna wines that are not DOC wines, just because of their border or their vineyard location. But the DOCG would also, for Etna, refocus the attention on quality and lower yields, which I think could be very important. And because it is such a very boutique, very small area, I mean, we only have about 1,200 hectares planted and only about 1,000 hectares in production for Etna DOC wines. Sorry, only Ragusa area. That's funny.
Area, DOCG. We know, Giovanni. We know. That's the moment.
Yeah, but anything's possible. If there is a DOCG to form, it will happen in the next 10 years or so. We may see paperwork filed in the next 4 years, 5 years, but it does take time to define what that is. And with the growing number of producers, producer members, they all have to agree more or less on what those definitions will be. And so that takes some negotiation and, again, a lot of bureaucracy. But it's possible.
Do you see the majority of the Etna producers favorable for the OCG, or I mean, not yet?
Yeah, that's the other side of this coin. The producers that are establishing themselves now or have established themselves up to this point, I believe, that are using Etna DOC are relatively content with that idea, and to sort of separate the idea or splay the idea of what Etna is, if it's a DOC or IGT or Vino da Tavola or Sicily DOC, what is it that Etna is? And I think in this moment it could confuse the conversation about what Etna is if it happens too quickly. But 30 years ago, we had between 5 and 8 producers bottling wines every year. And now we have over 100. And every day there are new permits and new licenses being filed with the Camera di Commercio. Well, before the quarantine, at least.
Considering the amount of vineyard on Mount Etna, I think that amount of winemakers is really a lot. What do you think?
It could be significantly more, actually. We have a lot of area that isn't claimed as DOC property, but it's within the territory. A lot of it is national park and UNESCO heritage site. So there's some give and take as to what property will be used or usable, but currently it is expanding. And we'll just have to wait and see what the next steps are. Absolutely, I'll include it in the second edition of the new wines at Mount Etna, I promise.
Oh, well, we still have to finish the first book. And now you're thinking the second edition. Well, there's a lot to talk, but it's 7, and we took a lot of time to discuss. And hi, Millie. Yes, she said yes, she needs another meeting, another conversation with Ben. And promise, and you have to promise to come back to L'Isola Bella Stories. Thanks a lot.
Let's do it.
It's a pleasure to talk to you and to learn more about Mount Etna and its wines. See you soon. And
absolutely.
And guys, I'll meet you next Wednesday again with L'Isola Bella Stories, episode 2. Our guest will be Virginia Borghese, talking about the myth and the magic of her historic family garden. See you. Bye. Grazie. A presto.
Ciao, Dorian.
Ciao. Ciao, Ben. Grazie. Ciao.
Ciao.